Hey, my name is Leo. I'm 35 years old, and I tune and restore pianos for a living. I spend my days inside the guts of old instruments, coaxing things that have gone silent back into sound. For 13 years, Frankie and I sat in the same two seats at the far end of Sal's diner counter, every Sunday morning, without fail. And for 13 years, she had exactly one joke. So the Sunday after I got engaged to another woman, when Frankie walked into Sal's, looked at me, and said that same old joke like it had never once been a joke. "You're not allowed to date anyone else," and then slid into the seat beside me, I finally understood, 13 years too late, that it never had been. Let me back up. I met Frankie when we were both 22, both broke, both freshly destroyed by people who'd had the good sense to leave us. It was a January morning at Sal's, the only place in town that did a $2 coffee with free refills, and I'd taken the last stool at the end of the counter, and she'd come in out of the cold and taken the one beside it, and we'd struck up the kind of conversation that only happens between two strangers who are both pretending they're fine and both very obviously not. She was a tattoo artist, bold and loud and quick, all the things I'm not. I'm careful. I work in millimeters and halftones. She works in permanent ink on living skin. We had no business being friends. But that first morning turned into the next Sunday, and the next, and somewhere in there it became a thing without either of us deciding it. The far end of Sal's counter. 2 seats, every Sunday. For 13 years. There's a night I have to tell you about, because the whole story turns on it, even though I spent 13 years pretending it didn't happen. It was a few months in. A snowstorm shut the whole town down, and Sal kept the diner open anyway, and it was just the three of us, me, Frankie, and Sal behind the counter, in the warm light while the snow came down outside. We'd been talking for hours, and at some point Frankie went quiet, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and there was a moment. You know the kind. The air changed. We were leaning toward each other across 2 stools, and the whole rest of my life was balanced on the next 3 seconds. And I pulled back. I want to be honest about why, because it took me 13 years to be honest about it with myself. Frankie had just been through something terrible. She'd lost her mother that fall, and her ex had walked out in the middle of it, and she was raw in a way that scared me. And the thing is, she'd already become the most important person in my life. The thought of kissing her and getting it wrong, of mistaking her grief for something else, of reaching for more and losing the one good thing I had, it terrified me more than being alone did. So in the second before everything could change, I got scared, and I made a joke. "Tell you what," I said, leaning back, grinning like an idiot, "if we're both still single and pathetic at 35, I'll marry you. Deal?" Something flickered across her face, there and gone, too fast to read, or maybe I just didn't want to read it. And then she laughed and stuck out her hand and said, "Deal. And until then, Leo, you're not allowed to date anyone else." We shook on it, and that became the bit. That became us. Every single time, for 13 years, that one of us started seeing someone, the other would say it. I'd come into Sal's and mention a date, and Frankie would point her fork at me and go, "You know, you're not allowed to date anyone else." She'd tell me about some guy, and I'd say, "Hey, not allowed. We have a deal." We must have said it 500 times. It was the safest, funniest, most weightless thing in the world. And it was the truest thing either of us ever said, and I was too much of a coward to know it. Let me give you those 13 years, so you understand what I was sitting next to. I knew how Frankie took her coffee, and how she took bad news. I knew the 3 songs that made her cry, and the one that made her dance in the diner aisle until Sal threatened to charge her rent. She knew I tuned by ear before I tuned by meter, that I talked to the pianos I'm fixing, that I hadn't spoken to my father in years and why. We had keys to each other's apartments and no romantic claim on each other's lives, and somehow that felt like the most natural arrangement in the world. When my father died, the one I hadn't spoken to, it was Frankie who drove 4 hours to a funeral of a man she'd never met, and stood beside me at the back of a church full of strangers, and held my hand the entire service and never said a word, because she knew there were no words and didn't insult me by reaching for them. And when she got out of the car after, back at Sal's, she pointed at me across the roof and said, gently, "By the way, still not allowed to date anyone else." And I laughed for the first time in a week, because she knew exactly when I needed the joke and exactly how much weight it could carry. When her studio flooded and she lost a year of work and most of her savings, she slept on my couch for 2 months, and we ate cereal for dinner and watched terrible movies, and not once did either of us cross a line, and I told myself that was proof we were just friends. I had it exactly backward. We didn't cross the line because the line was the only thing protecting the most important relationship either of us had. You don't risk the one good thing. So we kept the joke, and the joke kept us safe, and safe is a very lonely place to keep the love of your life. There was the time I dated a violinist for almost a year, and Frankie was perfectly lovely to her. And the day we broke up, Frankie showed up with takeout and said, "Idiot. You're not allowed to date anyone else, I keep telling you." And I felt, for just a second, a flood of something like relief that I shoved straight back down. There was the time she dated a guy named Marcus for 8 months, and I was inexplicably, unreasonably miserable the entire time, and blamed it on a bad season at work. 500 times. 13 years, the truth in plain sight, wearing a clown nose so neither of us had to be afraid of it. I should tell you about Sal, because Sal saw all of it long before we did. Sal owned the diner. He was somewhere past 70 by then, a wide, slow man who'd run that counter for 40 years and buried a wife he'd adored. He poured our coffee every Sunday for 13 years, and he watched us the way you watch a slow sunrise, like he knew exactly where it was going and was just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Once, years in, when Frankie had stepped out to take a call, Sal refilled my cup and said, without looking at me, "You know, my Rosa sat in that exact seat the first time I ever saw her. Right where your girl sits." He nodded at Frankie's empty stool. "She's not my girl, Sal, she's my best friend." Sal smiled the smile of a man who's been married 30 years and has heard every kind of lie a person tells themselves. "Sure, kid," he said, "whatever you need to call it." And he walked off down the counter, and I told myself he was just a sentimental old man. He wasn't. He was the only one of us paying attention. Then, this past spring, I got engaged. Her name was Kate. She was kind and steady and genuinely good, and I want to be clear about that, because what happened next isn't a story about a bad woman. Kate did nothing wrong. I met her at a recital. She played cello, beautifully, and she was warm and easy to be with, and she loved me, and I was 35 years old and tired of being alone, and somewhere in the back of my mind a clock had quietly run out. The deal was 35. The joke had a deadline, and the deadline had arrived, and the joke was still just a joke. Frankie had never once, in 13 years, said it like she meant it. So I told myself the thing I'd been telling myself the whole time, that Frankie was my best friend, that the snowstorm night was just two sad kids and a moment that passed, that the bit was just a bit. And I asked Kate to marry me, and she said yes, and I was happy. I really was. Or I'd gotten so good at the story that I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The Sunday after I proposed, I told Frankie at the counter. I watched it land. I watched something go very still behind her eyes, the way the air goes still before snow. And then she smiled, a good smile, a real one. She's not a liar, and she said, "Leo, that's wonderful. She's lucky." She hugged me, hard, longer than usual, and then she got quiet in a way Frankie never got quiet, and she didn't say the joke. That was the thing I noticed, even through my own obliviousness. For 13 years, any mention of dating got the line. You're not allowed to date anyone else. And here I was, engaged. The biggest dating news there could be. And the line didn't come. The joke just sat there between us, conspicuous in its absence, like an empty stool. The next few Sundays were strange. Frankie was a little less there each week. She left earlier. She laughed a beat late. Once I caught her looking at me when she thought I was reading the menu, and the look on her face was one I'd never seen on her in 13 years, and I looked away fast because some part of me already knew, and I wasn't ready to know it. Sal noticed too. The third strange Sunday, after Frankie left early again, he set down the coffee pot and finally said what he'd been holding for 13 years. "You're really gonna do it," he said. "Marry the cello player." "I am." Sal looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, 13 years that girl has sat at the end of my counter. I've seen married couples come and go in less time with half of what you two have got. You found the love of your life at 22, kid, and you've spent 13 years calling it a Sunday." He leaned on the counter. "The seat beside you only fits one person at a time. You're about to fill it permanent. You sure it's got the right name on it? Because I watched her face when you told her. And I've buried the only woman I ever loved, so I know exactly what that face was, even if you won't let yourself." I didn't answer him. I put money on the counter and I left, and I drove home angry, and I was angry because he was right and I'd built an entire engagement on top of not knowing it. The next Sunday, Frankie was late. She'd never been late in 13 years. I sat at the counter and watched the door, and the coffee went cold, and I told myself she wasn't coming, that the engagement had finally broken whatever we were, that I'd traded 13 years of Sundays for a story I'd told myself to stay safe. Sal kept refilling my cup and not saying anything, which was somehow worse than if he'd said something. And then, 20 minutes late, the door opened, and Frankie came in out of the cold. She didn't take her coat off. She walked the length of the counter to where I sat, and she stood in front of me, and she looked more frightened than I had ever seen her. Frankie, who was never frightened of anything, who put needles in strangers' skin all day without blinking. Her hands were shaking. "I've been sitting in my car for an hour," she said, "trying to decide whether to come in here and ruin everything, or to be a good friend and let you go marry her and keep my mouth shut forever." She took a breath that shook. "And I decided I've kept my mouth shut for 13 years, and it's gotten me a front row seat to watch you marry somebody else, and I can't do the noble thing anymore. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, because she's wonderful, and you're happy, and I'm about to be the most selfish person in the world." "Frankie, you're not allowed to date anyone else," she said, and it was the joke. The same 8 words she'd said 500 times, but she didn't say them like the joke. She said them with her voice cracking down the middle, with 13 years behind them, with tears standing in her eyes, and then she slid into the seat beside me, her seat, the one she'd sat in every Sunday since we were 22, and she said it again, quietly, just for me. "You're not allowed to date anyone else." Because it was never a joke, Leo, not once. Not the snowstorm night, not any of the 500 times since. I made that deal when I was 22, and I meant it that night, and I've meant it every single Sunday for 13 years, and I watched you date every woman in this town, and I said our stupid line, and laughed, and died a little every time, because the line was the only way I could tell you I loved you without losing you. A tear went down her face, and now you're going to marry her, and I will be happy for you, I swear I will, but I could not let you do it without saying it out loud one time. I love you, I've always loved you, the deal was real. The whole diner had gone silent. Sal had stopped pouring coffee. And the story I'd been telling myself for 13 years, that the snowstorm was nothing, that the bit was just a bit, that Frankie was just my best friend. That story didn't just crack, it shattered all at once, and underneath it was the truth I'd buried so deep I'd convinced myself it wasn't there. I'd pulled back that snowstorm night because I was scared. I'd made the joke to stay safe, and I'd spent 13 years calling the love of my life my best friend, because naming it meant risking it. And I am a careful man, a man who works in millimeters, and I had been too careful with the one thing that should have made me reckless. "Frankie," I said, and my voice didn't work right. I pulled back that night because I was terrified, not because I didn't feel it, because I did, and you just lost your mom, and you were the best thing in my life, and I couldn't stand the thought of getting it wrong and losing you. I was crying now too, in the middle of Sal's diner, 35 years old. I made the joke because I was a coward, and I've been a coward for 13 years. I told myself it was just a bit because the truth was too big to hold. I love you. I think I've loved you since that snowstorm. I just buried it so deep I almost married someone else to keep from digging it up. She grabbed my hand on the counter. "What about Kate?" And that brought me back to earth, because she was right, and that was the part that wasn't simple, and I wasn't going to pretend it was. I didn't kiss Frankie in the diner. I want you to know that, because it matters. I told her I had to do the right thing first, the honest thing, before I had any right to her. Then I went to my workshop and sat in front of a half-restored piano in the dark for 2 hours, because I needed to be sure, and a man owes that much to everyone involved. I thought about Kate, her steadiness, the way she'd built our whole future in her head, the cello she'd play in the evenings while I worked. I thought about what it would do to her, and I made myself ask the hardest question there is. Was I leaving Kate because I loved Frankie, or just because Frankie had finally said the brave thing and I was caught up in the rush of it? But you can't tune a thing you can't hear, and sitting in that dark workshop I could finally hear it, the note I'd been deafening myself to for 13 years. It had been Frankie since the snowstorm. It had been Frankie through every woman I dated to fill the silence. Marrying Kate wouldn't have been building a life, it would have been burying one, with a good woman as the headstone. And Kate deserved a man whose whole heart showed up, not one who'd reserved a seat in it for someone else 13 years ago, and never taken the name off. That was the cruelest part, and the clearest. Staying with Kate wouldn't have been the kind thing, it would just have been the cowardly thing wearing a kind thing's coat. I'd done that for 13 years already. I was done, and I drove to Kate's that afternoon, and I had the hardest conversation of my life. I told Kate the truth, all of it. She deserved nothing less. And Kate, kind, steady, perceptive Kate, listened to the whole thing, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said something I'll never forget. "I knew," she said softly, "not the details, but I knew there was a chair in your heart with somebody else's name on it. I felt it every time you came back from those Sunday breakfasts. I told myself I could love you enough to fill it." A tear slid down her cheek. "You can't marry me out of a clock running out, Leo. I'd rather lose you now than be the woman a man settled for because he was too scared to want the real thing." She took off the ring and pressed it into my hand, and she said, "Go, before I change my mind and beg you to stay, which would be bad for both of us." And then she did the bravest, most gracious thing. She almost smiled, and she said, "She sounds like the love of your life. Don't you dare waste another 13 years. It wasn't clean, it wasn't painless. I hurt a good woman, and I'll carry that. But Kate was right, and so was Sal, and so was the joke I'd been telling for 13 years. I went back to the diner that evening. Frankie was there, in her seat, waiting, because of course she was. Sal had kept the place open past closing and was very busy wiping a spotless counter at the far end, pretending not to watch. I sat down in my seat, beside her, where I'd sat every Sunday for 13 years. I did the right thing, I said. It cost what it should have cost. I'm not proud of how long it took me to get here. I turned to her, but I'm here. And Frankie, you're not allowed to date anyone else. I finally said it the way it was always meant to be said, no joke in it at all. Because it was never a deal about being single and pathetic at 35. It was me, at 22, trying to tell you I'd wait my whole life. I just didn't know that's what I was saying. She kissed me then, in Sal's empty diner, on the 2 seats at the end of the counter, and down at the far end, an old man who'd buried the love of his life and recognized ours from the first January morning, quietly said, to nobody, finally, and turned off half the lights to give us the dark. We were married a year later, at the diner, naturally. Sal closed it for the day, and we filled it with everyone we loved, and Frankie and I said our vows standing at the end of the counter, beside the 2 seats, and Sal gave her away because both her parents were gone, and he'd been more of a father to both of us than either of us had any right to expect. He cried through the whole thing, so did I. He passed 2 years ago, Sal did. He left us the diner. We kept it exactly as it was, same counter, same stools, same 2 seats at the end, which we don't reserve but which everyone in town somehow knows not to take on a Sunday morning. We run it together now, the careful piano tuner and the bold tattoo artist, and we have a little girl who's already louder than me and steadier than her mother, and on the wall above our 2 seats there's a small framed photo of Sal behind his counter, watching, the way he always was. Our daughter sits between us on Sunday mornings now, on a stool Sal would have pulled up special. The other week she announced, at full diner volume, that when she grows up she's going to marry her best friend from school, because you're not supposed to date anyone else once you find your person. Frankie looked at me over the top of her head, and neither of us could speak for a second. We hadn't taught her that. She'd just watched us, the way Sal used to watch us, and somehow understood the whole thing faster than I did in 13 years. For a long time I thought the joke was the safe thing, the thing that let us love each other without the risk. I thought I was being smart, all those years, keeping the truth folded up small inside a bit we could both laugh at. But that wasn't smart. That was 13 years I'll never get back, 13 years of sitting beside the love of my life and calling it a Sunday because I was too careful to call it what it was. She told me 500 times, every single time in plain words, hidden inside a joke we'd both agreed not to take seriously. You're not allowed to date anyone else. It was the most honest thing anyone ever said to me, and I laughed it off 500 times because the truth was sitting right beside me and I was too afraid to turn my head and look at it. The seat beside you only fits one person at a time. Sal taught me that, the hard way, by almost letting me fill mine with the wrong name. I almost spent my whole life calling it a joke. Thank God she walked back in out of the cold, sat down beside me one last time, and finally made me hear it. You're not allowed to date anyone else. I never was. I just took 13 years to say it back.